Whether you're lying awake at 3 in the morning, driving through empty highways, or just looking for something to fill the quiet hours, welcome. This is a story about the single, most dangerous decision our species ever made. A choice so catastrophic that we're still paying the price 10,000 years later. And yet, without it, you wouldn't be here listening to this. Cities wouldn't exist, and human civilization as we know it would never have emerged from the endless cycles of hunting and gathering. If you're drawn to long-form storytelling about forgotten turning points, about the moments when everything changed, then settle in. This isn't just history. This is the story of how we accidentally trapped ourselves in a cage of our own making and called it progress. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's go back. Back to when the world was wild, when humans were few, and when the most revolutionary idea in history was about to take root in the fertile soil of the Middle East. For nearly 300,000 years, our ancestors lived as nomads. They woke with the sun, moved with the seasons, and followed the great migrations of animals across landscapes that stretched endlessly in every direction. They owned nothing because they needed to own nothing. Everything they required was carried in their hands, their memory, or the knowledge passed down through countless generations around countless fires. These weren't the grunting cavemen of popular imagination. By 10,000 years ago, humans had already painted masterpieces on cave walls, carved intricate figurines from mammoth ivory, and developed technologies so sophisticated that we still struggle to replicate them. They had mastered fire, created composite tools, and developed oral traditions so rich and complex that entire encyclopedias of knowledge lived solely in human memory. Their world was abundant. Archaeological evidence from sites across the globe reveals a startling truth that challenges everything we thought we knew about prehistoric life. These hunter-gatherers weren't desperately scraping by on the edge of starvation. Their diets were diverse, nutritious, and reliable. Bone analysis shows they were taller, stronger, and healthier than the farmers who would eventually replace them. A typical foraging group might know and use over 200 different plant species. They understood which roots were edible and which were poisonous, when berries ripened and when nuts fell, where to find water in drought years, and how to read the subtle signs that predicted weather changes weeks in advance. This wasn't primitive knowledge. This was science without laboratories, medicine without hospitals, and education without schools. And they worked less than we do. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies consistently show that subsistence activities took only 20 to 30 hours per week. The rest of their time was spent on what economists would call leisure, but what was really the business of being human: storytelling, crafting, playing, resting, and the endless social interactions that bound communities together. But around 12,000 years ago, something began to shift. Not everywhere at once, and not because of some grand plan or sudden revelation. Instead, in a handful of river valleys scattered across the world, small groups of humans started to notice something. The wild grasses they collected each season, the ones with the largest, most nutritious seeds, seemed to grow better in certain spots. Places where old campsites had been, where organic waste had enriched the soil, where the natural disturbance of human activity had somehow encouraged plant growth. At first, it was barely noticeable. Maybe someone scattered a few extra seeds near a favored camping spot before moving on. Maybe they weeded around particularly productive patches of wild wheat or barley. Maybe they began returning to the same locations year after year, not just because the hunting was good or the water was clean, but because the plants were thriving. This is how the most momentous revolution in human history began. Not with a bang, but with a whisper. Not with intention, but with accident. Not with conquest, but with curiosity. The Fertile Crescent, that arc of rich soil stretching from modern-day Turkey through Syria and Iraq to the shores of the Persian Gulf, became the unlikely stage for humanity's first experiment with domestication. Here, wild ancestors of wheat, barley, lentils, and peas grew in dense stands that could feed entire communities for months. Here, wild sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs roamed in herds, large enough to sustain hunting pressure year after year. But something else was happening in the Fertile Crescent, something that would prove just as important as the abundance of domesticable species. The climate was changing. The last ice age was ending, and with it came a period of unusual stability. For the first time in human history, weather patterns became predictable enough to plan around. Rainfall arrived on schedule, temperatures remained within manageable ranges, and the violent climate swings that had defined the Pleistocene gradually smoothed into the gentler rhythms of what geologists call the Holocene. This stability created a window of opportunity, a brief moment in geological time when the risks of staying in one place were finally outweighed by the benefits. And it was in this window that the first humans began the slow, irreversible process of tying themselves to the land. At sites like Jericho, one of the world's oldest continuously inhabited settlements, we can see this transformation happening in real time. The earliest levels, dating back nearly 12,000 years, show the remains of a mobile foraging society. Simple shelters, temporary hearths, and tool assemblages designed for people who moved frequently and traveled light. But as we move up through the archaeological layers, something changes. The shelters become more substantial, built to last months rather than weeks. Storage pits appear, designed to hold surplus grain through lean seasons. The tool assemblages shift from portable, multi-purpose implements to specialized equipment for processing specific crops. And then, in levels dating to around 9,000 years ago, we find something unprecedented in human history. A wall, not a simple windbreak or temporary barrier, but a massive stone fortification complete with towers and gates. This wasn't built by nomads. This was built by people who had something to defend, something they couldn't simply pack up and carry away when danger approached. The wall at Jericho represents more than just a shift in architecture. It represents a fundamental change in human psychology. For the first time in our species' existence, we had become attached to place rather than process, to possessions rather than relationships, to territory rather than territory. But why build a wall at all? What were they defending against? The traditional answer has always been other humans, rival groups competing for the same resources. But recent archaeological work suggests something more complex and more troubling. They weren't just defending against external enemies. They were defending against the consequences of their own success. Because here's the thing about farming that nobody tells you. It works too well. A single acre of cultivated wheat can feed far more people than 100 acres of wild grassland. Population densities that would have been impossible for hunter-gatherers suddenly became not just feasible, but inevitable. Villages that started with 50 people grew to 500, then 5,000, and with that growth came problems that nomadic societies had never faced. Waste disposal in permanent settlements, disease transmission in crowded conditions, social tensions when people couldn't simply walk away from conflicts, resource management when the landscape couldn't regenerate between human impacts. The wall at Jericho wasn't just keeping enemies out, it was keeping farmers in. It was the first physical manifestation of a trap that we're still living in today. Because once you've invested years of labor in clearing fields, building irrigation systems, and constructing permanent shelters, you can't just abandon them when things get difficult. You have to stay and fight. You have to defend what you've built, even when what you've built is slowly destroying the world that created you. This is the paradox at the heart of the Neolithic Revolution. Every solution created new problems. Every advance demanded new sacrifices. Every step toward civilization was also a step away from the freedom, health, and ecological balance that had sustained our species for hundreds of thousands of years. But there was no going back. Because once some groups had made the transition to agriculture, they held an insurmountable advantage in any competition with their hunter-gatherer neighbors. Farmers could support much larger populations, maintain standing armies, and accumulate the material surpluses necessary for technological innovation. Within just a few thousand years, agricultural societies had spread across the globe, not because farming was better for individual humans, but because farming was better at producing humans. The transformation wasn't just about food production, it was about time itself. Hunter-gatherers lived in what anthropologists call mythic time, a cyclical rhythm where past, present, and future flowed together in endless repetition. The seasons returned, the animals migrated, the stories were retold, and life followed patterns that had remained essentially unchanged for millennia. But farmers had to think linearly. They had to plan for specific futures, manage resources across seasons, and coordinate labor according to rigid schedules. They invented the calendar not to mark celebrations, but to predict when crops needed planting. They developed mathematics not for abstract contemplation, but to calculate seed ratios and harvest yields. And with linear time came linear thinking, cause and effect, problem and solution, progress and regress. The cyclical worldview that had sustained hunter-gatherers for countless generations gave way to the progressive mindset that still dominates human thinking today. The idea that tomorrow should be better than yesterday, that problems exist to be solved, that the natural world exists to be improved upon. This shift in consciousness was perhaps more revolutionary than any change in technology or social organization. Because once humans began to see themselves as separate from nature rather than part of it, once they began to imagine that the world could be remade according to human desires rather than natural rhythms, there was no limit to what they might attempt to control. The first farmers didn't wake up one morning and decide to reinvent human civilization. They made small choices, practical decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. A family might notice that the wild emmer wheat grew thicker near their winter camp, so they decided to stay a few extra weeks to harvest it. Another group might have scattered some leftover grain near a reliable water source, thinking they'd return next season to see what grew. These weren't grand gestures toward progress. They were tiny acts of optimization, the same kind of problem solving that had kept humans alive for 300 millennia. But each small decision created new constraints, new dependencies, new reasons to stay put just a little longer. The archaeological record from sites like Abu Huraira in Syria tells this story in microscopic detail. In the earliest levels, dating back 13,000 years, we find the remains of a classic foraging society. Over 150 different plant species in their diet, gazelle bones showing seasonal hunting patterns, toolkits designed for mobility and flexibility. But layer by layer, year by year, we can watch this flexibility disappear. The plant species become fewer but more concentrated. The animal bones shift from wild gazelle to domesticated sheep and goats. The tools become heavier, more specialized, designed for people who no longer need to carry everything they own. And in the human bones themselves, we see the physical cost of this transition. The skeletons from the farming levels show arthritis, repetitive stress injuries, and nutritional deficiencies that were rare among their foraging ancestors. The average height decreased, dental health deteriorated, life expectancy dropped, yet the population exploded. This is the cruel mathematics of the Neolithic Revolution. It wasn't better for individuals, but it was devastatingly effective at producing more individuals. A hunting and gathering band might support one person per square kilometer. An early farming village could support 50 people in the same space. The sheer weight of numbers meant that wherever farmers encountered foragers, the outcome was inevitable. But numbers alone don't explain why farming spread so rapidly and so completely. The real answer lies in something more subtle and more disturbing. Farming didn't just change what humans ate or where they lived, it changed what they were. Consider the psychological transformation required to become a farmer. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans had lived in the present tense. Food was found, not grown. Shelter was built when needed, not maintained year-round. Possessions were carried or abandoned, not accumulated and stored. But farming demanded a completely different relationship with time and space. Seeds planted in spring wouldn't yield food until autumn. Fields cleared this year might not reach full productivity for several seasons. Domesticated animals represented investments that paid dividends across generations. This shift toward delayed gratification, toward thinking in terms of years rather than days, toward managing resources across seasons and cycles, fundamentally rewired human consciousness. We became creatures of anticipation and anxiety, constantly planning for futures that might never arrive, constantly worried about variables beyond our control. The weather became an obsession. Crop diseases became catastrophes. Failed harvests became famines. Hunter-gatherers had always lived with uncertainty, but they'd also lived with options. If one food source failed, they moved to another. If one area became inhospitable, they found somewhere else to call home. Farmers had fewer options, but more to lose. Everything they'd built, everything they'd invested, everything they'd worked toward was tied to specific pieces of land. They couldn't simply walk away when things went wrong. They had to find solutions, and when solutions failed, They had to find better solutions. This is how humans became problem solvers rather than problem avoiders. This is how we learned to see obstacles not as signals to change course, but as challenges to overcome. This is how we developed the peculiar human obsession with control, with improvement, with bending the world to our will rather than adapting ourselves to the world's rhythms. The earliest farmers developed irrigation systems to control water flow. They built granaries to control food storage. They domesticated animals to control protein production. Each innovation solved immediate problems while creating new dependencies, new vulnerabilities, new reasons to innovate further. At Çatalhöyük in Turkey, one of the world's earliest cities, we can see this process accelerating. The settlement, occupied from roughly 9,000 to 7,000 years ago, housed up to 8,000 people in a dense maze of interconnected buildings. There were no streets, no public spaces, no clear boundaries between individual households. People entered their homes through holes in the roof, climbing down ladders into living spaces that were simultaneously private and communal. The walls were covered with elaborate murals depicting wild bulls, hunting scenes, and geometric patterns that might represent maps, calendars, or cosmological diagrams. But beneath the artistic sophistication lay a society under tremendous stress. The human remains show evidence of violence, malnutrition, and epidemic diseases. The buildings had to be constantly rebuilt as structures collapsed under their own weight. Waste management was a perpetual crisis in a settlement where 8,000 people shared a few acres of space. Yet people kept coming. The city kept growing because despite the problems, despite the stress, despite the violence and disease and overcrowding, Çatalhöyük offered something that nomadic life couldn't match. It offered certainty. It offered specialization. It offered the possibility that human ingenuity could create a better world than the one nature had provided. The murals on the walls of Çatalhöyük tell us something crucial about how farming changed human consciousness. Unlike the cave paintings created by hunter-gatherers, which depicted animals as they appeared in nature, the art at Çatalhöyük showed animals as humans wished them to be. Bulls were painted larger than life, more perfect than any real bull. Hunting scenes showed humans always triumphant, prey always abundant. This wasn't documentary art. This was aspirational art. Art that depicted not what was, but what could be. Art that revealed a species learning to imagine alternatives to natural reality, learning to envision worlds that didn't yet exist, but might someday be built. The transition from foraging to farming wasn't just about food production. It was about the birth of human ambition, the discovery that reality was negotiable, that the given world was just a starting point for something better. This realization was simultaneously the most liberating and most dangerous idea our species ever developed. Because once humans learned to see the world as improvable, there was no natural limit to their improvements. Once they discovered that human effort could create abundance where nature provided scarcity, they began to imagine that human effort could solve any problem, overcome any obstacle, perfect any imperfection. The farmers of the early Neolithic were still connected to natural rhythms, still dependent on seasonal cycles, still vulnerable to droughts and floods and the other forces beyond human control. But they'd taken the first steps toward the illusion of mastery that would define all subsequent human development. They'd planted the seeds of civilization, not knowing they were also planting the seeds of humanity's greatest triumphs and most terrible mistakes. Because the same impulse that led to agriculture would eventually lead to cities, to empires, to industrial revolution, to technologies that could reshape continents and alter the climate of the entire planet. The Neolithic Revolution didn't just change how humans lived, it changed what humans thought they were capable of. And once that change took hold, once our species developed the conviction that the world existed to be improved rather than simply inhabited, there was no force on earth that could contain the consequences. The trap was closing, but it wouldn't be fully sprung for several thousand more years. First would come the villages, then the towns, then the cities, then the empires. Each step seemed logical, even inevitable, when viewed from inside the process. Each innovation solved real problems, met genuine needs, improved actual lives. But each step also moved humanity further from the ecological balance that had sustained us for hundreds of thousands of years, further from the social structures that had kept us healthy and relatively peaceful, further from the cyclical worldview that had made meaning from repetition rather than progress. The farmers of 10,000 years ago couldn't have imagined where their small experiments with plant domestication would ultimately lead. They were just trying to feed their families, just trying to create a little more security in an uncertain world. They had no way of knowing they were setting in motion forces that would eventually transform every landscape on Earth, eliminate thousands of species, alter the chemistry of the atmosphere, and create forms of human suffering that nomadic societies had never experienced. But that transformation was still millennia in the future. For now, in the early villages scattered across the Fertile Crescent, humans were still learning the basic skills that would make civilization possible. They were learning to live with strangers, to resolve conflicts without simply walking away, to organize labor on scales larger than extended families. They were learning, in other words, to be civilized. And that learning process would prove to be far more complicated, far more costly, and far more irreversible than anyone could have possibly imagined. They were learning to count. Not the intuitive counting that comes naturally to any human mind, 1 gazelle, 2 gazelles, 3 gazelles, but abstract counting, mathematical counting. The kind of counting that could track grain stores across seasons, calculate seed ratios for optimal yields, and measure land boundaries that existed only in human imagination. The earliest known counting tokens appear in the archaeological record around the same time as the first permanent settlements. Small clay objects, each representing specific quantities of specific goods. One token for a sheep, another for a measure of grain, another for a jar of oil. These weren't decorative objects or religious artifacts. They were the world's first accounting system, born from the practical necessity of managing resources too complex for human memory alone. But counting led to something far more dangerous than bookkeeping. It led to the concept of ownership. Because once you could measure and record quantities, you could also determine who controlled those quantities, who owned which fields, who owed what debt, who deserved which share of the harvest. Hunter-gatherers had possessed things, of course, tools, weapons, ornaments, sacred objects. But possession in nomadic societies was limited by a simple physical constraint. You could only own what you could carry. Everything else belonged to the landscape, to the group, to the endless cycle of seasons and migrations. Farmers faced no such limitations. They could accumulate grain in massive stone granaries. They could breed livestock in numbers that would have been impossible for mobile societies to manage. They could build houses, workshops, temples, and monuments that would endure for generations. For the first time in human history, wealth could outlive the people who created it. This shift from portable possessions to accumulated property changed the fundamental structure of human society. Among hunter-gatherers, status was largely situational and temporary. The best tracker might lead during hunting season, the most skilled storyteller during winter gatherings, the wisest elder during times of crisis. But these roles were fluid, contextual, based on immediate needs rather than permanent hierarchies. Agricultural societies couldn't function that way. Managing complex farming operations required consistent leadership across seasons and years. Coordinating the labor of hundreds or thousands of people demanded clear chains of command. Protecting accumulated wealth necessitated permanent security arrangements. Temporary leadership gave way to permanent authority, and permanent authority inevitably led to permanent inequality. The archaeological evidence for this transformation is written in the bones of the dead. Early farming communities show relatively egalitarian burial patterns. Most graves contain similar collections of everyday objects, with only subtle differences in grave goods that might reflect personal preferences rather than social stratification. But as agricultural societies matured, their cemeteries began to tell a different story. Some graves became elaborate affairs, filled with precious objects, exotic materials imported from distant regions, and clear markers of elevated status. Other graves remained simple, containing only the most basic necessities for whatever afterlife these people imagined. At sites like Varna in Bulgaria, dating to around 6,000 years ago, archaeologists have found burials that contain more gold than most modern jewelry stores. Not gold ornaments or decorative objects, but solid gold artifacts whose only purpose seems to have been displaying wealth. One grave alone contained over 3 pounds of gold objects, representing more accumulated precious metal than entire hunter-gatherer societies would have encountered in centuries. But the most telling detail isn't the presence of gold in rich graves. It's the complete absence of gold in poor ones. For the first time in human history, some people were being buried with evidence of vast material wealth, while others were being buried with evidence of having owned almost nothing at all. This wasn't just inequality of possessions. It was inequality of opportunity, inequality of power, inequality of basic human dignity. Because in agricultural societies, unlike nomadic ones, your circumstances at birth largely determined your circumstances at death. The children of wealthy farmers inherited land, livestock, and accumulated resources. The children of poor farmers inherited debt, obligation, and dependency. Social mobility, which had been the default condition for mobile societies, became the rare exception in settled ones. Most people were born into specific roles: farmer, herder, craftsperson, laborer, and died in those same roles, regardless of their individual talents, interests, or ambitions. But perhaps the most profound change wasn't in how people lived, but in how they thought about living. Agricultural societies developed the world's first systematic ideologies, coherent belief systems that explained and justified their new forms of social organization. The gods of hunter-gatherer societies had been wild, unpredictable, closely connected to natural forces and animal spirits. They were beings you negotiated with, appeased, sometimes tricked, but rarely commanded or controlled. They reflected a worldview where humans were participants in natural systems rather than masters of them. The gods of agricultural societies were different. They were organized into hierarchies that mirrored human political structures. They had specific domains of responsibility: gods of the harvest, gods of rainfall, gods of fertility, gods of war. They could be bargained with through sacrifice, influenced through ritual, and enlisted as allies in human projects. More importantly, these agricultural gods had opinions about human behavior. They rewarded virtue and punished vice, but their definitions of virtue and vice aligned suspiciously well with the needs of agricultural societies. Hard work was virtuous. Obedience to authority was virtuous. Accepting your designated role in society was virtuous. Questioning established hierarchies, abandoning your responsibilities, or returning to nomadic ways was not just impractical, it was sinful. At Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, the world's oldest known temple complex, we can see this ideological transformation taking physical form. Built around 11,000 years ago, before agriculture had fully established itself in the region, Göbekli Tepe represents something unprecedented in human history: monumental architecture created by people who were still essentially hunter-gatherers. The massive stone pillars, arranged in precise circles and covered with intricate carvings of wild animals, required coordinated labor from hundreds of people across many seasons. But unlike later monuments built by agricultural societies, Göbekli Tepe shows no evidence of social stratification among its builders. There are no royal tombs, no elite quarters, no clear markers of hierarchical organization. Instead, the site seems to have functioned as a gathering place where different nomadic groups came together for seasonal ceremonies, shared feasts, and collaborative construction projects. It represents a brief moment in human history when large-scale organization was possible without permanent inequality, when monumental ambitions could be achieved without sacrificing the essential freedoms that had defined human society for hundreds of thousands of years. But that moment didn't last. As agricultural practices spread throughout the region, Göbekli Tepe was gradually abandoned and eventually buried under tons of earth and stone. Whether this burial was intentional or accidental remains unclear, but the symbolism is hard to ignore. The old ways were literally being covered up, forgotten, replaced by new forms of organization that had no room for the kind of egalitarian cooperation that had built those mysterious circles of stone. The transition wasn't immediate or uniform. For several thousand years, agricultural and nomadic societies coexisted, traded, intermarried, and learned from each other. Some groups adopted farming seasonally while maintaining nomadic lifestyles during other parts of the year. Others incorporated domesticated plants and animals into essentially foraging economies. But ultimately, the mathematics of population growth made coexistence impossible. Agricultural societies could support much larger populations in much smaller areas. They could maintain standing armies, accumulate material surpluses, and invest in technological innovations that gave them decisive advantages in any direct competition with nomadic groups. The process wasn't always violent, though violence certainly played a role. Often, it was simply a matter of displacement. As farming communities expanded, they occupied the most fertile and well-watered lands, forcing nomadic groups into increasingly marginal territories. Hunter-gatherers found themselves pushed into deserts, mountains, forests, and other environments that couldn't support large agricultural populations. Some nomadic societies adapted by becoming pastoralists, specializing in the herding of domesticated animals while maintaining many aspects of their mobile lifestyles. These pastoral societies often served as intermediaries between settled farmers and remaining hunter-gatherer groups, creating complex networks of trade, alliance, and conflict that would shape human history for millennia to come. But even successful pastoral adaptations represented a fundamental departure from the foraging life that had sustained humanity for so long. Herders were tied to their animals just as farmers were tied to their fields. They might remain mobile, but they were no longer truly free. Their movements were constrained by the needs of their livestock, their social structures shaped by the requirements of animal management, their worldviews increasingly dominated by concepts of ownership and control. The last free hunters were being systematically eliminated, not through genocide or conquest, but through the inexorable logic of agricultural expansion. Each generation saw fewer wild spaces, fewer wild animals, fewer opportunities for the kind of life that had once been humanity's only option. Those who resisted this transformation found themselves cast as barbarians, savages, obstacles to progress and civilization. The agricultural societies developed elaborate justifications for their expansion, stories that portrayed settled life as naturally superior to nomadic life, farming as more virtuous than foraging, civilization as the inevitable destination of human development. These weren't necessarily conscious propaganda campaigns. The people telling these stories genuinely believed them because the stories helped make sense of the radical changes they were experiencing. When your entire way of life depends on staying in one place, working the same fields year after year, accepting rigid social hierarchies and permanent inequalities, you need to believe that this way of life is not just necessary, but good. So the alternative, acknowledging that agriculture was a trap that had sacrificed human freedom, health, and happiness for the sake of population growth and technological development, was too psychologically devastating to contemplate. But the trap of life became more entrenched, more complex was still closing. With each passing generation, the agricultural way, more difficult to abandon. Settlements grew into villages, villages grew into towns, towns grew into cities. Social hierarchies became more rigid, technological systems more intricate, human beings more dependent on artificial environments of their own creation. The surplus grain that had initially seemed like such an obvious advantage began to create problems that nomadic societies had never faced. Stored grain attracted rodents, insects, and fungal infections. Large populations, concentrated in small areas, generated waste that contaminated water sources and soil. Epidemic diseases, rare among scattered hunter-gatherer bands, became routine killers in dense agricultural settlements. Each problem demanded solutions, and each solution created new problems, requiring additional solutions. Pest control led to the development of poisons that also harmed humans. Waste management required complex engineering projects that demanded specialized knowledge and coordinated labor. Disease control necessitated medical specialists, quarantine procedures, and eventually the identification of entire classes of people as inherently unclean or dangerous. The simple life of the early farmers was becoming anything but simple. Every aspect of existence required management, oversight, expert knowledge. The intuitive skills that had once enabled any human to find food, create shelter, make tools, and navigate social relationships were being replaced by specialized knowledge that took years to acquire and could only be maintained through constant practice. For the first time in human history, it became possible for people to be genuinely helpless, unable to meet their basic survival needs without depending on complex social and technological systems. A hunter-gatherer separated from their group might struggle, but they retained the fundamental skills necessary for independent survival. A farmer separated from their community faced a much bleaker prospect. This dependency wasn't accidental. It was built into the structure of agricultural society. Specialization made the system more efficient, but it also made individuals within the system more vulnerable. The blacksmith who couldn't farm, the farmer who couldn't make tools, the priest who couldn't do either, each was entirely dependent on the others for survival. That dependency created new forms of power and new opportunities for exploitation. Those who controlled the most essential resources, land, water, stored grain, specialized knowledge, could extract tribute, labor, and obedience from those who depended on access to those resources. The egalitarian ethos that had characterized hunter-gatherer societies became not just impractical, but dangerous in agricultural contexts. If everyone was truly equal, who would organize the massive labor projects that farming required? Who would make the difficult decisions about resource allocation during lean years? Who would maintain order when thousands of people with different interests and backgrounds were forced to live in close proximity? Agricultural societies answered these questions by institutionalizing inequality. They created formal classes of rulers and subjects, masters and servants, owners and workers. They developed legal systems that codified these relationships and religious systems that sanctified them. They built physical structures, walls, palaces, temples that literally elevated some people above others. These weren't temporary expedients or unfortunate side effects of agricultural development. They were functional requirements, necessary components of any society complex enough to support large populations through farming. The alternative wasn't reformed agriculture, but return to foraging. And return to foraging meant accepting the population levels that foraging could sustain. By the time agricultural societies were fully established, that alternative was no longer viable. The world contained too many people for hunting and gathering to feed them all. The landscapes that had once supported abundant wild resources had been converted to farmland, pasture, and settlements. The knowledge and skills necessary for successful foraging had been lost, forgotten, or actively suppressed. Humanity had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The trap that had begun with scattered seeds and seasonal camps had become a cage that encompassed entire continents. The species that had once roamed freely across endless landscapes now found itself confined to artificial environments of its own creation, dependent on technologies it barely understood, subject to social hierarchies that served no one's interests except those at the very top. And yet, paradoxically, this cage was also the foundation for everything we now consider distinctly human. Art, literature, music, philosophy, science, mathematics, all emerged from the surplus time and energy that agricultural society made possible. The same specialization that created dependency also created expertise. The same inequality that generated suffering also generated the resources necessary for monumental achievements. The cities that would soon rise from these early farming villages would become centers of learning and creativity unlike anything the world had ever seen. The complex social hierarchies that seemed so oppressive would also enable forms of cooperation and coordination that would eventually carry humans to every corner of the planet and beyond. The Neolithic Revolution was simultaneously humanity's greatest disaster and its greatest triumph. It destroyed a way of life that had sustained our species for hundreds of thousands of years, but it also created the conditions that would enable us to build civilizations, explore the cosmos, and contemplate our own existence in ways that would have been impossible for our foraging ancestors. The farmers working their fields 10,000 years ago couldn't have imagined the ultimate consequences of their simple decision to plant seeds instead of simply gathering them. They were just trying to feed their families, just trying to create a little more security in an uncertain world. But their small innovations had set in motion forces that would reshape every aspect of human existence, creating forms of abundance and forms of misery that the natural world had never produced. The revolution was accelerating now, moving beyond individual villages and regional experiments towards something larger, more systematic, more irreversible. The age of cities was about to begin, and with it would come new forms of human organization that would make the early farming communities seem as simple and innocent as the hunter-gatherer bands they had replaced. But that transformation was still generations away. For now, in the scattered villages of the early Neolithic, humans were still learning the basic skills that civilization would require. They were learning to live with strangers, to accept permanent inequality, to depend on systems too complex for any individual to fully understand. They were learning, in other words, to be us. The first cities didn't announce themselves with fanfare or grand declarations. They crept into existence like shadows at dusk, so gradually that the people living through the transformation might not have noticed they were witnessing the birth of something entirely new. What had once been large villages simply grew larger, denser, more complex, until one day someone looked around and realized they were no longer living in an expanded farming community, but in something unprecedented in human history. Uruk, rising from the alluvial plains of Mesopotamia around 6,000 years ago, became the world's first true city. Not the first large settlement, not the first complex community, but the first place where human organization reached a scale and sophistication that fundamentally altered what it meant to be human. At its peak, Uruk housed somewhere between 25 and 50,000 people within its walls. To put that in perspective, for most of human history, the largest group any individual would encounter in their entire lifetime might number in the hundreds. Now tens of thousands of strangers lived within walking distance of each other, sharing the same water sources, breathing the same air, competing for the same resources. The psychological impact of this density cannot be overstated. The human brain evolved for small group dynamics where everyone knew everyone else's name, face, and family history, suddenly had to navigate a social environment where most people were permanently anonymous. You could pass the same person on the street every day for years and never learn their story, never understand their role in the larger community, never develop the personal relationships that had once formed the foundation of all human cooperation. This anonymity was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. For the first time in human history, you could reinvent yourself, escape your family's reputation, start fresh in ways that would have been impossible in smaller communities where everyone knew your entire lineage. But you could also disappear, become lost, find yourself surrounded by thousands of people, yet utterly alone. The city demanded new forms of organization to manage this complexity. The informal leadership structures that had worked in villages, where respected elders or skilled individuals naturally assumed authority, couldn't coordinate the activities of tens of thousands of people with competing interests and specialized roles. Uruk developed the world's first formal government, complete with professional administrators, written laws, and institutional hierarchies that operated independently of personal relationships. For the first time, power became abstract, embodied not in individual charisma or proven competence, but in official positions that could be transferred from person to person. The king of Uruk wielded authority not because he was the best hunter, the wisest counselor, or the most skilled craftsperson, but because he occupied a role that existed independently of his personal qualities. This was a revolutionary concept that would reshape human society for millennia to come. Power was no longer something you earned through demonstrated ability. It was something you inherited, seized, or were appointed to by others who already possessed it. But the king couldn't govern alone. The sheer scale of urban life required armies of scribes, tax collectors, judges, and enforcers. For the first time in human history, significant numbers of people made their living not by producing food or manufacturing goods, but by managing other people. The bureaucrat was born, and with them came the endless proliferation of rules, regulations, and procedures that would become the invisible architecture of civilized life. The written word emerged not from artistic inspiration or religious revelation, but from the practical necessity of keeping track of complex transactions across a community too large for human memory to manage. The earliest known writing consists of administrative records, inventories of grain stores, lists of tax obligations, records of legal disputes, and accounts of resource distribution. These cuneiform tablets, pressed into wet clay with reed styluses, represent one of the most profound cognitive shifts in human history. For hundreds of thousands of years, all human knowledge had existed only in living memory, passed from person to person through speech, song, and demonstration. Now, for the first time, information could exist independently of human consciousness, stored in physical objects that could outlive their creators. Writing changed how humans thought about time, memory, and truth itself. Oral traditions had been flexible, adaptive, changing slightly with each retelling to meet the needs of current circumstances. But written records were fixed, permanent, claiming to preserve the exact details of events and agreements across generations. This permanence created new possibilities for both justice and oppression. Written laws could provide consistent standards that applied equally to all citizens, but they could also encode inequalities and injustices in forms that were much harder to challenge or change than informal customs had been. The temple complexes that dominated Uruk's skyline weren't just religious buildings. They were the world's first corporations, vast economic enterprises that controlled enormous amounts of land, employed thousands of workers, and coordinated trade relationships across hundreds of miles. The priests who ran these institutions weren't just spiritual leaders. They were the world's first professional managers, developing sophisticated techniques for resource allocation, labor organization, and long-term planning. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of urban life was the degree to which it separated humans from the natural world that had shaped their evolution. In Uruk, most people lived their entire lives without ever participating directly in food production. They ate grain they didn't grow, meat from animals they didn't hunt, vegetables cultivated by strangers in fields they might never see. This separation created unprecedented vulnerability. A hunter-gatherer who found themselves alone in the wilderness might struggle, but they possessed the skills necessary for independent survival. An urban dweller, separated from the city's support systems, faced a much bleaker prospect. Most city inhabitants had no idea how to find edible plants, track animals, create fire without tools, or construct adequate shelter from natural materials. For the first time in human history, large numbers of people had become entirely dependent on artificial systems for their basic survival. This dependency wasn't accidental. It was built into the structure of urban civilization. The specialization that made cities possible also made their inhabitants helpless outside the urban environment. The potter, who spent their days shaping clay, had no time to learn farming. The merchant who traveled trade routes couldn't also master metalworking. The scribe who kept administrative records couldn't simultaneously develop hunting skills. Each person became expert in one narrow domain while losing the broad competencies that had once been necessary for human survival. This specialization enabled remarkable innovations. Urban craftspeople, freed from the need to produce their own food, could dedicate themselves entirely to perfecting their skills. The quality of pottery, metalwork, textiles, and other manufactured goods improved dramatically. Technologies that would have been impossible for part-time artisans working in small villages became routine achievements for full-time specialists supported by urban infrastructure. But specialization also created new forms of inequality, more extreme than anything agricultural villages had experienced. In farming communities, everyone understood the basic requirements of survival, and differences in wealth or status were constrained by the practical limits of what individuals could accumulate and manage. In cities, some people controlled resources and knowledge that others couldn't even comprehend, creating power imbalances that had no natural limits. The palace elites of Uruk lived in luxury that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. Archaeological excavations reveal rooms decorated with precious metals and exotic materials imported from thousands of miles away, elaborate furniture crafted by master artisans, and personal possessions that represented more accumulated wealth than entire villages had once controlled. Meanwhile, the urban poor lived in conditions that were often worse than what their farming ancestors had experienced. Crowded into cramped quarters with inadequate sanitation, breathing air polluted by industrial activities, eating monotonous diets of processed grains, they suffered from diseases and malnutrition that had been rare in smaller communities. The city created abundance and scarcity simultaneously, often within the same neighborhoods. The same urban systems that enabled unprecedented luxury for some also generated unprecedented misery for others. This wasn't an unfortunate side effect of urban development. It was a necessary component of how cities functioned. Urban civilization required enormous amounts of labor to maintain its complex infrastructure. Someone had to build and repair the walls, dig and maintain the irrigation channels, transport goods from the countryside, construct the monumental buildings that proclaim the city's power and prosperity. Much of this work was physically demanding, dangerous, and poorly compensated. In agricultural villages, hard work at least connected you directly to the results of your efforts. You planted seeds and harvested grain, tended animals, and consumed their products, built shelters, and lived inside them. In cities, most workers labored on projects whose ultimate purpose they might not understand, creating wealth they would never share, building structures they might never be allowed to enter. This disconnection between effort and reward required new ideologies to maintain social stability. Cities developed elaborate justifications for their hierarchical structures, stories that explained why some people deserved luxury while others deserved hardship, why some were born to command while others were born to obey. These weren't cynical propaganda campaigns designed to deceive the masses. The elites who promoted these ideologies generally believed them just as fervently as the common people who accepted them. Everyone needed explanations for the radical inequalities that urban life had created, frameworks that could make sense of social arrangements that would have been impossible in smaller, more egalitarian communities. Religious systems evolved to sanctify urban hierarchies, developing concepts of divine kingship, sacred authority, and cosmological order that mirrored earthly power structures. The gods themselves were reimagined as urban rulers, governing heavenly bureaucracies that legitimized their earthly counterparts. Legal systems codified these relationships in written laws that claimed divine inspiration and eternal validity. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest known legal documents, explicitly established different punishments for the same crimes depending on the social status of both perpetrators and victims. The life of a slave was literally worth less than the life of a free citizen, not as a practical expedient, but as a matter of fundamental justice. These legal codes weren't aberrations or temporary compromises. They were honest acknowledgments of how urban civilization actually functioned. Cities required inequality to operate, and inequality required justification to be sustainable. The law provided that justification by transforming practical necessities into moral imperatives. But the most profound transformation wasn't in how cities organized their hierarchies, but in how they changed human consciousness itself. urban life created new forms of awareness, new ways of thinking about identity, purpose, and possibility that would have been inconceivable to earlier generations. For the first time in human history, individuals could imagine futures radically different from their present circumstances. In hunter-gatherer societies, children generally grew up to live much the same lives as their parents, following seasonal patterns and cultural practices that had remained essentially unchanged for generations. In agricultural villages, most people were born into specific roles and died in those same roles. But cities offered social mobility, at least in theory. The merchant's son might become a priest. The craftsperson's daughter might marry into the administrative class. The talented individual might rise through merit or cunning to positions of authority that would have been impossible in more rigid social systems. This possibility of transformation created new forms of ambition and anxiety. For the first time, humans had to grapple with the psychological burden of unlimited potential. If you could theoretically become anything, then whatever you actually became reflected not just circumstances, but choices, not just fate, but personal responsibility. The urban dweller faced questions that previous generations had never needed to contemplate. What should I do with my life? Who should I become? How do I find meaning in a world where traditional roles and relationships no longer provided clear guidance? These weren't philosophical luxuries reserved for intellectual elites. They were practical psychological challenges that every urban resident had to navigate. The anonymity and complexity of city life meant that identity itself became a project rather than an inheritance, something to be constructed rather than simply accepted. This construction of identity required new forms of self-knowledge and self-presentation. Urban dwellers had to learn to manage their reputations among strangers, to signal their status and intentions through clothing, behavior, and possessions, to navigate social situations where the informal cues that worked in smaller communities were no longer reliable. The city created the concept of the individual as we now understand it, an autonomous agent, responsible for their own choices, capable of self-transformation, defined not by family lineage or tribal membership, but by personal achievements and characteristics. But this individuality came at a cost. The social bonds that had once provided security and meaning in smaller communities were weakened or severed entirely. Urban dwellers found themselves free to become whoever they chose, but also isolated from the networks of mutual obligation and support that had once made human life meaningful and secure. The loneliness of urban life became one of its defining characteristics, even as cities brought unprecedented numbers of people into close proximity. You could be surrounded by thousands of neighbors, yet know none of them intimately. You could participate in vast collective enterprises, yet feel personally insignificant. You could enjoy material comforts that would have amazed your ancestors, yet feel spiritually empty in ways they would have found incomprehensible. Cities also changed human relationships with time itself. The seasonal rhythms that had organized agricultural life gave way to artificial schedules dictated by administrative convenience and economic efficiency. Work began when supervisors decided it should begin, not when natural conditions made it appropriate. Rest came when permitted by authority, not when the body demanded it. The urban day was divided into precise units, measured and managed with increasing sophistication. Time became a resource to be allocated, saved, wasted, or stolen. The natural rhythms that had synchronized human activity with cosmic cycles for hundreds of thousands of years were replaced by artificial rhythms designed to maximize productivity and coordination within human systems. This transformations of temporal experience had profound psychological consequences. Urban dwellers began to experience time as linear rather than cyclical, progressive rather than repetitive, scarce rather than abundant. The future became something to be planned for and controlled rather than something that would naturally unfold according to eternal patterns. The anxiety that would become characteristic of urban civilization was born from this new relationship with time. When the future is open-ended and controllable, every present moment becomes a choice point with potentially lasting consequences. When time is scarce and valuable, every minute wasted represents a lost opportunity. When progress is possible, stagnation becomes failure. These weren't abstract philosophical concerns. They were lived realities that shaped how urban dwellers experienced their daily existence. The farmer who planted seeds in spring and harvested grain in autumn participated in cycles that connected them to cosmic rhythms. The urban worker who reported to a supervisor at a prescribed time to perform repetitive tasks until released participated in artificial rhythms that served human institutions rather than natural patterns. The disconnection from natural cycles contributed to forms of psychological distress that had been rare in earlier societies. Urban dwellers suffered from what we might now recognize as depression, anxiety, and existential crisis, conditions that seemed to emerge when humans were separated from the environmental and social contexts that had shaped their evolution. But cities also created new possibilities for human connection and creativity that would have been impossible in smaller communities. The concentration of diverse people, skills, and resources enabled forms of artistic, intellectual, and technological achievement that transformed human understanding of what was possible. The epic poetry that would become humanity's first literature emerged from urban environments where professional storytellers could dedicate themselves full-time to perfecting their craft. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge that would eventually enable navigation, architecture, and engineering developed in urban centers, where scribes and scholars could build on each other's work across generations. The monumental architecture that still inspires awe thousands of years later required the coordinated labor and accumulated resources that only cities could provide. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the pyramids of Egypt, the temples of the Indus Valley, all testified to forms of human ambition and capability that would have been inconceivable without urban organization. These achievements weren't just impressive displays of technical skill. They were statements about human possibility, declarations that mortals could create works rivaling the gods themselves. The city taught humans to think in terms of permanence, legacy, and transcendence in ways that nomadic and agricultural societies never had. But transcendence came at a price. The same urban systems that enabled monumental achievements also created forms of human suffering that the natural world had never produced. Slavery, warfare, environmental destruction, and systematic oppression all reached new heights of intensity and sophistication in urban environments. The city was simultaneously humanity's greatest achievement and its most dangerous experiment. It solved problems that had limited human development for hundreds of thousands of years, but it also created problems that threatened to destroy the very foundations of human civilization. The revolution that had begun with scattered seeds and seasonal camps was now accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control or fully comprehend. The forces unleashed by urban development would soon spread across continents, transforming landscapes, eliminating entire ways of life, and setting the stage for conflicts and catastrophes that would dwarf anything humanity had previously experienced. The trap was no longer closing, it had closed. There was no going back to simpler times, no return to the ecological balance and social equality that had characterized earlier forms of human organization. The path forward led through increasingly complex forms of civilization, each solving old problems while creating new ones, each achieving greater heights while risking greater disasters. The humans walking the streets of Uruk 6,000 years ago couldn't have imagined where their urban experiment would ultimately lead. They were just trying to manage the practical challenges of living together in unprecedented numbers, just trying to create systems that could coordinate complex activities across large populations. But their innovations had set in motion forces that would eventually reshape every aspect of human existence, creating forms of power and knowledge that would enable their descendants to build empires spanning continents, develop technologies that could alter the planet's climate, and contemplate questions about existence and meaning that would have been incomprehensible to earlier generations. The age of cities had begun, and with it came the promise and peril of everything we now call civilization. The next chapter of human development would unfold on an even grander scale, with even higher stakes, as the urban experiment spread across the ancient world and began to transform entire regions into something the earth had never seen before. The scribes bent over their clay tablets in the temple complexes of Uruk had no idea they were documenting the birth of something that would consume the world. Their careful cuneiform marks, recording grain shipments, tax obligations, and labor assignments, seemed like simple administrative tasks. But each pressed wedge in wet clay was actually a neuron firing in the brain of a vast new organism, one that would grow to encompass continents and reshape the very chemistry of the atmosphere. Because what emerged from those first cities wasn't just a new way of organizing human settlements. It was a new form of life entirely, one that fed on human labor and natural resources with an appetite that would prove to be literally insatiable. The urban civilization spreading outward from Mesopotamia was developing its own logic, its own imperatives, its own forms of reproduction and growth that operated independently of human intention or control. Trade routes became the nervous system of this new organism. Merchants carrying copper from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and cedar wood from Lebanon weren't just engaging in commerce. They were creating the circulatory system that would allow urban civilization to expand far beyond the river valleys where it had originated. Each successful trade expedition strengthened the networks that bound distant regions together, making them increasingly dependent on resources and technologies they couldn't produce locally. The psychology of expansion was built into the structure of urban life itself. Cities required constant inputs of materials that their immediate environments couldn't provide. The bronze weapons that maintained their military superiority needed tin from distant mountains. The monumental architecture that proclaimed their power required stone quarried hundreds of miles away. The luxury goods that justified their social hierarchies demanded trade relationships spanning entire continents. This wasn't optional. Urban civilization couldn't remain static or self-contained without collapsing under its own contradictions. It had to grow, expand, incorporate new territories and populations into its sphere of influence, or face the kind of resource depletion and social breakdown that would make its complex hierarchies impossible to maintain. The Akkadian Empire, emerging around 4,500 years ago under Sargon the Great, became the world's first attempt to solve these problems through systematic conquest. Rather than depending on voluntary trade relationships that could be disrupted by conflict or competition, the Akkadians decided to directly control the territories that supplied their cities essential resources. This wasn't mere greed or ambition, though both played their roles. It was in logical response to the structural requirements of urban civilization. If your society depends on copper from specific mountain regions, silver from particular river valleys, and grain from certain agricultural areas, then controlling those regions becomes a matter of existential necessity rather than optional aggrandizement. But empire created its own problems. The administrative apparatus needed to govern distant territories dwarfed anything earlier civilizations had developed. Suddenly, you needed not just local bureaucrats and scribes, but provincial governors, military commanders, intelligence networks, and communication systems that could coordinate activities across thousands of miles. The Akkadian royal archives, preserved in cuneiform tablets discovered by archaeologists, reveal the staggering complexity of imperial administration. Daily reports from provincial governors detailing local crop yields, tax collections, and security threats. Instructions from the central government about resource allocation, military deployments, and legal procedures. Diplomatic correspondence with other powers negotiating trade agreements, territorial boundaries, and military alliances. Each tablet represents hours of skilled labor by professional scribes, supported by vast networks of messengers, translators, and local officials. The information systems needed to govern an empire required more human resources than many entire cities had previously contained. The cure for urban civilization's resource problems was creating even greater resource demands. But the most profound change wasn't administrative, it was psychological. Empire transformed how humans thought about space, identity, and possibility in ways that would prove irreversible. For the first time in history, individuals could imagine themselves as part of something larger than their immediate community, larger even than their native region or ethnic group. The Akkadian soldier campaigning in distant mountains, the Mesopotamian administrator governing Syrian cities, the Anatolian merchant trading in Indus Valley ports, all participated in a form of identity that transcended the local loyalties that had defined human consciousness for hundreds of thousands of years. This cosmopolitan awareness created unprecedented opportunities for cultural exchange and technological innovation. Ideas, techniques, and artistic styles moved along imperial trade routes with a speed and scale that would have been impossible in earlier periods. The wheel, developed in one region, spread rapidly across the entire imperial network. Bronze working techniques, writing systems, and architectural innovations diffused throughout the known world within generations rather than millennia. But cosmopolitan identity also created new forms of alienation and psychological displacement. The imperial citizen might feel connected to a vast civilization, but they were also separated from the intimate local communities that had once provided meaning and security. They were citizens of everywhere and nowhere, participants in grand historical processes, but often powerless to influence the forces that shaped their daily lives. The environmental consequences of imperial expansion were becoming visible for the first time in human history. The cedar forests of Lebanon, systematically harvested to supply construction projects across the Mesopotamian Empire, began showing signs of depletion that would eventually reduce them to scattered remnants. The irrigation systems that supported intensive agriculture in river valleys started experiencing salinization problems that would plague the region for millennia. These weren't isolated incidents, but symptoms of a fundamental shift in humanity's relationship with the natural world. For hundreds of thousands of years, human impact on the environment had been local and temporary. Even large agricultural settlements had modified their immediate surroundings without affecting broader ecological systems. And so, here we are, 10,000 years later, still living inside the trap our ancestors accidentally built. Every morning we wake in artificial boxes, eat food grown by strangers, follow schedules that have nothing to do with the sun or seasons. We've forgotten the names of plants, the songs of birds, the rhythm of our own breath. We call this progress, but our hunter-gatherer ancestors would have called it madness. The Neolithic Revolution didn't just change how we live, it changed what we think we are. We became builders instead of dwellers, owners instead of sharers, consumers instead of participants. And now, as cities sprawl across continents and screens replace stars, we find ourselves homesick for a home we've never known, aching for freedoms we've never tasted, mourning a wildness we helped destroy. But perhaps that ache itself is the gift. Perhaps remembering where we came from is the first step toward imagining where we might go. Because the trap is still closing, the machine still accelerating, and somewhere in the space between what we've lost and what we might become lies the possibility of finding our way home.